Well, is equality enough? Now that we have LGBT equality, will society move on elsewhere? It appears that although equality has been achieved, there is something more that activists like Peter Tatchell want. Is the slippery slope argument just a scare story from some Christians and conservative people, or are we actually on a slippery slope?
Okay, here's a very simple solution, and that is we need to understand. We need to understand ethics, we need to understand sexual ones, we need to understand where they come from, and we especially need to understand sex within the context of marriage and relationships. So that's this week's Kitchen Table. Okay, now the trouble is when we argue about this, Steve, or discuss this, people already have presuppositions. They already have things that they just say, oh, well, you know, you're going to argue this and you're going to look for whatever. And I think we need to think about it a lot more deeply. And I've actually engaged with an Australian gentleman called Peter Tatchell. I'm assuming you've heard of him.
I have indeed.
Yeah, and he and I, we actually had a very pleasant dinner together. And we had, I think it ended up being a 2-hour discussion, which was filmed on Revelation TV, and I'll maybe put a link to that. And I challenged him on some things, and he agreed. And it, for me, it was a shocking thing. But he's recently come back and posted a 20-minute video, which for me is enlightening and shocking. So here's the first couple of minutes of it.
I guess my starting point is that equality is now the mantra of the UK and indeed global LGBT plus movement. So the idea that equality is not enough is very controversial and challenging. But I've got to say that although equality has much to recommend it, I don't feel comfortable with the way most of our community has lowered its aspirations to the limited goal of equal rights. They are important, of course, but my argument is they are not enough. I ask the question, whatever happened to the lofty ideals of queer liberation and sexual freedom? Where did they go? I think we have too often moved away from defining our needs on our terms and instead fallen rather meekly into the prevailing heterosexual consensus. So look at same-sex marriage. Of course, winning marriage equality was tremendously important, and I was spearheading that campaign from way back in 1992. So I agree that homophobic discrimination against same-sex couples is wrong, that it had to be challenged and defeated because it was a form of anti-LGBT plus discrimination. But then I would ask the question is, do we really think that the model of marriage is the best method or the best framework for acknowledging and recognizing relationships, whether they be opposite sex or same sex? My argument would be that if we were just starting from scratch, I don't think the marriage model would be the one that we would adopt.
Steve, what do you think?
Okay, that's interesting. It's an interesting video. I've watched it all, and he extrapolates on the issues that he deals with in the first 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, about relationships, sex, and marriage. Why do you think this talk by Peter Tatchell, who, by the way, sounds more English than Australian to me, but that could be because he's lived there a while. Yeah. Why do you think this talk is important?
Because I think it shows the agenda, and I think it shows where things are going. This is not just about equality. This is about something that's much, much more fundamental. And I agree with Tatchell on this, actually. There are things like justice, things like love, and so on, and philosophy and elsewhere. And I think that this is an extremely revealing video because it's showing the direction that at least he wants it to go.
So, I mean, as I'm watching it, I'm thinking this is less about identity politics, as you know, that seems to be the buzzword, but it's more about the queer theory aspect that somehow getting equality isn't the issue because we're not looking to do the same things, only, you know, with different forms. We're not looking to repeat heteronormative society. Is that what he's saying?
It's exactly what he's saying, and even words like heteronormative society. Now, what's important in all of this, he talks about the lofty ideals of queer liberation and sexual freedom. But what's important is, what does he mean by that? And for Peter Tatchell, and I've been involved with some of his followers and with him for many, many years, it means lowering the age of consent. It means pornography, what he calls eroticism. It means legitimizing things like sadomasochism. And above all else, it actually means destroying marriage, which he regards as a patriarchal institute. So for me, all of this is hugely important. And by the way, I think ultimately it will also come to pedophilia, because in the video, if you watch the whole video, he talks about not criminalizing older teenagers or younger teenagers even for having sex.
So when you talk about that, that does seem like a slippery slope argument. Do you think that there's evidence culturally that we're already in those directions? That would be a question I'd be wanting to ask you.
Yes, I do. I think the only one that we're not, and even then I think we're beginning to a little bit, is pedophilia, but the rest of it, yes. Mm-hmm. And I think that Tatchell is very concerned about educating children. There was an infamous correspondence he had in The Guardian whereby he defended basically a pedophile, and he denied that he was doing that, but he did say that in some cultures sex between boys and men was quite normal, and he was defending that. And I am concerned about that. By the way, he tells a lie in this, and I know that. So you could ask me, David, why is he telling a lie? And disown yourself.
Yeah. Why is he telling a lie in this? You say, is he being hypocritical about something or masking something?
Well, he says that since 1992, he says, I have always been a supporter of gay marriage. That is not true. In the year 2004, I think it was, he wrote an article in The Observer and The Guardian stating that those gay activists who were for same-sex marriage were basically traitors, that marriage was a patriarchal institution that had to be destroyed. I challenged him on this in the Revelation TV interview, and he agreed. He said, well, I've changed my mind. Well, here he is saying, I've always campaigned for this. Yeah. So both things cannot be right.
No, that's true.
I don't think he has changed his mind, by the way. I don't think he's for same-sex marriage. I just think he thinks that same-sex marriage is not marriage. And this video is a further dismantling of that.
So what's wrong with marriage? We're using the M word all the time there. What's he saying that's wrong with marriage, and how do we want to present a better vision of marriage? That would be my question to you. Okay. Because he's obviously presenting a vision of life that doesn't look like what we would present as a vision of life.
Yeah, and I think this is the key issue, actually. I don't think it's sexuality. I think it is marriage. I think marriage is the fundamental institution that's glued society together for the past 1,500, 2,000 years. I think it is extremely important, and I think the undermining of marriage through the divorce laws, through same-sex marriage, through other things as well. And now Tatchell wants to go much further and have a completely different philosophy. Then I think that is harmful for children. I think it's harmful for society. I think it's harmful for humanity as a whole. And I think it's what we get when we turn away from God. I put a verse there. I'd love you to read it, and then I'll maybe finish off with something.
Yeah, this is a very challenging verse. If you haven't heard this verse from the Bible before, from Romans chapter 1, Paul writing in the context of looking around the Greek world that he lived in the first century. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Is that the worshipping and serving of something that's created that's the issue in here?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's not using it. It's for me, it's what I call the IKEA philosophy, that you build it according to the maker's instructions. And I think that's a hugely important societal issue, and we shouldn't just divert it down one or two particular rabbit holes. I think Tatchell is right, by the way. I think he's got a challenge here. We need to think about more than equality. We must also understand love and justice. I think that's what Christianity does. By the way, I said to Tatchell when we left, I said, Peter, all the things that you are arguing for from government, you are going to get. and all the things that you want, you are not going to get. And that was love and justice and equality and so on. I think Christianity brings that. I don't think the queer theory of Peter Tatchell or other philosophies like that will bring it. So there's a challenge for us all. See you next week.
Yeah, see you next week. And next week, we're going to be looking at education. And somehow that dovetails with some of the ideas that we've talked about today. We're going to say, do you need education and who do you need that from? See you next week.